President Trump hosted a meeting with video game makers and their critics at the White House today. They're looking for ways to reduce youth violence following the Florida school shooting. And the president recently expressed shock at what young people are exposed to today.
The video games, the movies, the internet stuff is so violent. It's so incredible. I see it. I get to see things that you'd be amazed at. I have a very young son who I look at some of the things he's watching and I say, how is that possible? And this is what kids are watching.
Oh shit! Oh, don't kill me, man, please, please!
With the emergence of every new art form, there are those who are fearful, ignorant, and seek to censor it however they can. Art that is violent is targeted specifically more than any other kind due to religious beliefs, political leaning, and potentially scientific reasoning. From The Wild Bunch to Taxi Driver, from Elvis to Nine Inch Nails, there has always been opposition to controversial media. The same can be said about a newer art form, video games. Ever since the invention of the video game medium, there has been contention on the effects they have on children. From the creation of Doom and Mortal Kombat in the early 90s to the release of every single Grand Theft Auto game, a 2.5-decade-long battle continues to be waged around censorship. The real question is there any merit to this claim? Is there a good enough reason or evidence to prove censorship is warranted? Well, the answer is a bit more complicated than at first glance.
Claims that video games cause violence have generally remained unsupported. The claim has increased since the Columbine shooting, as the public attempted to rationalize the behavior of the shooter.
Some of these other killers, Dylan Klebold, Eric Harris of Columbine, were steeped in these games.
However, a study conducted by the U.S. Secret Service in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Education found that only 18% of mass shooters played violent video games, a rate lower than that of the general population. An analysis of trends conducted by Patrick M. Markey compared annual reports of violent crime from the FBI to rates of violent media, finding that though our current society has higher consumption of violent media, there are lower rates of violent crime.
But because most people don't consider research as heavily as they may consider their own feelings or claims made by public figures, there have been continuous efforts to censor and regulate video game content. Stricter video game ratings have been used to reduce fears in parents. However, these ratings are not effective in influencing the attitudes of the actual video game players. Initially, there was fear that the video game ratings may create a sort of forbidden fruit effect in young players, making them want to play games more because they are told not to. But this effect was not found in an experiment conducted in 2012, and it showed that the young video game players hardly even considered age regulations or warnings on game covers even when they did notice them. The evaluation of a game's worth had nothing to do with the ratings that they were assigned, regardless of content. There are heavy biases involved in individual ratings of video games that are influenced by many societal factors. One experiment conducted by James D. Ivory in 2009 found that video games were being labeled as having less negative effects when the individual is familiar with the video game or when asked to evaluate a specific game versus when the individual is asked about violent video games in general. These effects were found in both violent and non-violent games, indicating the vagueness of perceptions and ratings of video game effects in general.
The saturation of media claims about the negative effects of violent video games may partially be due to the lack of familiarity that reporters have with current video games. Reporters and other media heads tend to be older and have more negative view on video games as a newer form of media. An experiment in 2016 evaluating adults' view on video games found that subjects assigned games less negative attributes after they actually attempted to play them. These findings held for both violent and non-violent games. Similarly, a survey assessing parents' attitudes about video games as educational tools found that parents' own perceived competence with computers is linked to more positive assessment of video games as learning tools. Knowing the media seems to play a major role in how people evaluate the effects of video games.
Over the years, there have been several experiments concluding that there is little to no reason to censor violent video games. Public outcry against violent content may be an overreaction fueled by misinformation and scapegoating. An experiment conducted in 2010 found that the desensitizing effects of video game violence are not broadly applicable to all forms of video game violence. Non-justified violent behavior induced high levels of guilt in players, indicating that the appeal for violence in video games is primarily found when the violence is justified. Violent video games often allow people to act as heroes or vigilantes, using violence for good in the game, while video games with senseless or excessive violence towards groups perceived as helpless are not appealing or entertaining even to experienced video game players.
While, like anything else in our society, video games are not all good, they are not all bad. Though some links between video games and aggression do exist, their effects on society have often been blown out of proportion. A meta-analysis of over 30 studies about video games and aggression found mixed results, but found no links to gameplay and actual societal violence. Overall, more research needs to be done analyzing the effects of video games, but one thing is clear. Negative video game effects are over-reported and sensationalized as a mean to scapegoat violent events.